So I wanted to start by saying that when we were trying to decide what to open with, my husband here thought I should share one of my most embarrassing moments. I told him while he's trying to remember that moment, I'm trying to forget it. But if you ask me after this, I will share it with you. But today, we are going to be talking about the spiritual discipline of remembrance through the lens of memorials. And when I think about remembrance, the first thing I actually think about is my name. My name is Sarah Frances Rina Farmer. As the fifth generation, I bear the name Rina. Rina is my great, great, great grandmother who was enslaved. When she attempted to escape from the oppression of slavery and was caught, the man who had enslaved her was planning to punish her through physical violence, which was the norm during that time. But as the story goes, she prayed throughout the night, asking God to intervene, and God did. The wife of the slave master had a dream where God warned her not to harm Rina. Because of this dream, he relented from doing physical harm to her. When I think about this, I grew up seeing the women in my family pray, prayer warriors in the face of insurmountable odds. And when my aunties and my mom finally shared this story with me, somehow it made sense. Prayer became an access point to experience God's nature in new ways for them. I felt like I was initiated into that legacy when my mom took me to my first prayer meeting. My name is Sarah Frances Rina Farmer. Not only have I shared that story with my kids, I named my daughter Acacia Justice Rina Farmer. 6 generations later, she carries the memory of God's ability to see, hear, and rescue from great danger in response to prayer. And I want my kids more than anything else to not only know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I want them to know the God of Rina too.
Yeah. So why memorials for us? About a year ago, our family began to really have some intentional conversations about what it meant to faithfully steward stories of God's faithfulness. And one night we were up with our kids, usually in the evening time. We always spend time praying, singing songs to the Lord, or doing some type of Bible study. And so one night, just to see if what we're doing was landing, we had a conversation with our children and just said, hey, what is the most meaningful thing for you in the evening time? And our children communicated to us that the stories of our own faith journey were the things that they enjoyed most hearing. So we really intentionally leaned into that. And I think one of our hopes is that when we are no longer here, our children will be able to carry the stories of God's faithfulness in our own lives because of what we've shared in the ways in which we have been faithful stewards of what the Lord has done in our own lives.
So we have 2 primary goals this morning. The first is we want you to leave with a better understanding of why remembrance is so essential for our spiritual journey.
Yes.
And the second reason is we want you to walk away with practical things that we can do to more intentionally actually practice the spiritual discipline of remembrance. And so we'll be very interactive this morning, and we're going to start just with table conversation around memorials in society. So when you hear the word memorial, we know this word is often used in our society, and people create memorials all the time. So when you think around the word memorial, what is the first memorial that you think of, and what is the purpose of that memorial? So just talk at your table and see how many memorials you can think of at your table that we see all the time in society.
One of the things memorials do is they have the ability to transport us back into time and to allow us to experience the emotions of a space and a story in a very intimate way. And so it's one of the things I've noticed as we've been talking about memorials, the ability to transport our hearts and our imaginations back into space and in time.
Right, and something I appreciate about what you said is that you didn't know the story, and it invoked curiosity, similar to what your son, when he saw the horse, why are they so sad? That it invoked curiosity to kind of learn about like the connection and the story behind it. And so when we think about memorials or monuments, they often provide physical space and symbols for us as a society to collectively remember and process important events, people, and even tragic losses. And so part of, I think, our journey or our thinking is, what does remembering do for a society? And you've already kind of named some of that, right? It helps us to process, helps us to heal, it helps us to educate and instruct. Helps us to name our shared history, right? That's a shared history. Helps us to connect with one another around a significant marker.
Yeah.
And also helps us to affirm and even shape our values as a community. And so one of the things that I've really appreciated about preparing for this gathering is I knew that there were memorials in the Bible, but I hadn't actually thought about how pervasive they are and how many different ways in which those memorials are expressed in the Bible. So I want to go back to the table talk, and we talked first about society's memorials, and now I want you to think about biblical memorials. And just to kind of give a definition, and this is according to Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible. When we think about biblical memorials, they are an act, object, or observance that recalls God's past saving work or pledges of his people, ensuring remembrance both before God and our community. But I think something really does distinguish biblical memorials from maybe some of the memorials that's in society. And I would say who they point to.
That's right.
That biblical memorials always point back to the story of God, often revealing something about God's nature, serving to reinforce our faith in God. And so, once again, just take a moment around your table and think about any memorial you can think of in the Bible, and talk about that for a second. So these are like when we think about the vast ways, similar to what you're saying, Russ, that memorials might function and operate. We have physical objects, so Jacob's stone at Bethel, or the stones from Jordan, which we'll actually talk about in a second. The rainbow, the manna jar, or naming. We talked a little bit about naming, right? Jacob's wrestle with God, wasn't it Bethel? But even Abram to Abraham, or Sarai to Sarah, that naming, or even God's names, right? Where he commemorates in Exodus, right? God's name to remind people of his covenant and liberation. Also, songs of remembrance, like Miriam's song, for instance, Moses' song. Rituals and feasts, which we've already kind of talked about. And then also days of remembrance, the Sabbath, for instance, right? That's a day of remembrance. Then we also have things like actions and offerings, where even something as specific as when you do an offering, this portion of the offering is to symbolize this part of it. Or Cornelius's prayer and alms, right? It's an action and an offering as a memorial. And so when I also think about biblical memorials, does anyone know what this bird is? Okay. It's called a Sankofa. So this is a Ghanaian Akan African bird. And I'm not going to try to say the language, but I'll tell you what the language translates into. And it translates as, "It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten." And the bird, basically the feet facing forward is thinking about the future, but the bird is turned on his back, and what the bird has in his mouth is actually an egg, symbolic of future generations. And so partly when this symbol is used and described is precisely, I think, the purpose of a memorial, or one of the purposes it serves, is to go back and think about the things in the past that helps us move forward into the future. as one way of thinking about it. And so we remember our past, not just for nostalgic reasons, but really so that we could take our next faithful step into the future. And so I'm always, when I think about space and time, how memorial somehow stands in the middle of past, present, and future. And it does very significant things for our spiritual journey. And Ronnie is going to talk a little bit more about what what that is.
Yeah, so we want to take a second and briefly look at Joshua chapter 3 and chapter 4, because this story is such a great example of what we see in the Bible, the story of God around memorial. And so I'll give an overview of the story, and then we'll jump into the text and invite the Holy Spirit to speak to our hearts. But we're in Joshua chapter 3. Moses has just died, and the Lord raises up Joshua to lead the people into the promised land. And as the Lord is preparing Joshua to lead the people into the promised land, before them stands the Jordan River. And the Lord tells Joshua to get the priests and to take the Ark of the Covenant and to step into the waters. It is flood season, and so the waters are at a heightened stage. And so as the priests step into the water, the river parts, and the people of God, the entire nation, are able to walk on dry land all the way through the Jordan River. And so I want to spend a second talking about a conversation that Joshua has with the people before this miracle, and then a debrief conversation that he has with the people after this conversation. And so hear ye the word of the Lord. So Joshua chapter 3, verses 9 through 13. Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of your Lord God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, sound like termites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites." Keep going. Yep. When the whole nation had finished crossing Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." And so as the people are going through this river that has been parted, the Lord gives instruction to Joshua to tell the one person from each tribe to go back into the river and to actually grab a stone where the priests are standing, and to take that stone and to bring it to the camp as a memorial of what God has just done. And Joshua set up Gilgal, the 12 stones they had taken out of Jordan. He said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their parents, 'What do these stones mean?' Hey, dad, hey, mom, hey, granddad, what are these stones about? Tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until he had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord." So you can go back to the beginning, love. Yep. So let's just take a second and lean into this text right here. But I want to start in Joshua chapter 3, verses 9 through 13, which is the initial conversation that Joshua has with the people before this miracle takes place. But he says, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God." And he says this, he says, "This is how you will know that the living God is among you." And so the first thing I want to offer is that when God does a work and he encounters us, memorials and God's interaction with us is meant to remind us that God is with us, that the God who made the galaxies and the stars and the heaven is in our story, and he is in our midst. In Psalms 16, chapter 16, verse 8, the psalmist says, "I will not be shaken, for the Lord is at my right hand." When we become aware that God is with us. It roots us and gives us the capacity to stand strong in moments of opposition. And so there is a sense here where God is saying to the people, I want you to know that I am in your midst. And then the second part of this was really interesting is that God says that this is how you will know that I will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. And so the Lord begins to name all of the nations that the people of God, Israel, will encounter over the next 7 years. Now, what's so interesting about this text is that these fights haven't taken place yet. All right? And so what God begins to do is he begins to say that this moment in time will give you confidence for the battles ahead. This will be a moment that will root you and give you confidence and faith to believe that I can do the impossible on your behalf. When I was thinking about this story, I was reminded of a conversation that David had with Saul that we see in 1 Samuel chapter 17. King David is having a conversation with Saul and tells King Saul that he wants to go and take on Goliath, that he wants all the smoke. And so he's having a conversation and King Saul talking to him. He's like, hey, I'm just gonna let you know something. That guy's gonna kill you, man. He has been a warrior since his youth. David, you ain't gonna make it, bruh. You know, you just need to chill out. And so you're looking at this text, you're like, man, if I'm David, I'm like, oh, I'm not gonna make it. David responds and he says the most profound thing. This is 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 34 through 37. He says, your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. What is David doing? He is practicing the spiritual discipline of remembrance. He is looking at Goliath and he's looking back to the past. And I'm just saying y'all something, man. You got to be a crazy joker to go and grab a lamb out of the mouth of a bear or a lion. But he's looking back at God's hand of deliverance and saying, hey, God met me here. I'm telling you, he will be with me here. And so when we think about remembrance, the hope from the Lord is that these moments in time, we would steward them well so we will have hope for the future as we walk through our spiritual journey. Next text, love. And so that's the pre-conversation, the pre-orientation to the miracle. After the people go through the river, Joshua has another conversation. He says this. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until he had crossed over. The Lord your God did to Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. And so as these memorials, these stones are set up, the idea for the Lord is that the children, the next generation would walk by and they would say, hey, mom, dad, grandpa, tell me a little bit about these stones. And so the idea is that these stones would invoke curiosity. They would invoke questions around from the next generation so that the story of God might be shared with the generation in front of them. And so one of the things that we see here in this text is that memorials really are meant to be a means and a way by which the story of God is handed off to the next generation. The Bible says, I will commend your works to the next generation. And how might we do that? I believe one of the ways in which we do that is through memorial. Then the last thing I'll add here, particularly as it relates to this text, is just this idea. Let me back up and just say one more thing. When my lovely wife shared the story of Rhina with our daughter, Acacia, she asked 1,000 questions. She asked 1,000 questions about God. She asked 1,000 questions about Rhina's story. She asked 1,000 questions about what it meant for her in her spiritual journey. And the idea is that we would do those things, that when our children hear about the stories and the ways in which God has met us, that it would provoke curiosity, that would open up their hearts to receive God's testimony and his goodness. The story concludes, at least this passage of text, with Joshua just saying that the hope as well, that God did this so that the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful and that the people might always fear the Lord your God. And so memorials are for our community, but they're also for the nations. They become beacons of light that we can hold up to the ethnic, to the nations, to demonstrate God's faithfulness and his goodness in our own lives, so that people might know the goodness and the faithfulness of our God. And so with that in mind, certainly I want to share just really more intentionally how we've done that in our home. And then we'll transition into an interactive activity where you also get an opportunity to do that. And so last year, one of the things that we began to do was we began to collect stories from our own lives around God's faithfulness, and also invite our children to name moments in our spiritual journey we had prayed for God to do something miraculous, and he had answered our prayers. And so one of the stones that we currently have in this glass house, which sits in our house, is a stone that says, Elisha, Three Fires Camp. All right, and I'll share the story about this. Several years ago, when my oldest son, who's now 14, began middle school, he got severely bullied. So much so that it began to drastically shift his personality in his interactions with us at home. He became very temperamental. And just as a parent, there are moments where you try to talk to your child. If you're a parent, you can understand this. And it just feels like your words are not landing or having any impact. And so I began to talk to my wife, started having a conversation. I was like, babe, we have to pray for Elisha and ask God to meet him. And so we began to intentionally pray for him, asking the Lord to encounter his heart. And we had two requests in our prayer. The first request was that he would know God's presence. And then the second request was that the Lord would do something with this anger. And so we began to petition the Lord around this for our son, because it felt like we're kind of really at our end, and just saw such a drastic shift in his personality as he was being bullied at school. And so he went to Three Fires Camp 1 week. And what's so interesting about the story is that I'm a helicopter parent in our home. And we really aren't big campers. I don't like mosquitoes or bugs. And so my wife was telling me about the Three Fires Camp. I was like, I don't know about that, babe. But we ended up sending him anyway. And so I remember us coming to College Wesleyan Church, picking up Elisha, and he gets in the car. And like any parent would say, son, how was your week? How was Three Fires Camp? And the first thing he said, Dad, it was amazing. He said, Vicky was singing songs to the Lord. And he said, Dad, I felt God's presence. And soon as he said it, man, I just felt the Lord come over me. And we kept driving. We went to IHOP, and I just was trying to hold my tears because I didn't want to throw him off. And I was like, tell me more, son, about what happened at the camp. He was like, well, Miss Mandy was up preaching, Dad, and she was talking about the prodigal son. And she said, no matter what you do, you can always come home. And at the end, she invited us to give one thing to the Lord. And I told God I wanted him to take my anger. And so I walked up and I asked Jesus to take my anger. And when he said it, man, I just started bawling. I was bawling so hard in IHOP that my son looked at me. He said, Dad, if you cry anymore, I'm not going to share anything else with you. But that moment was so significant for us that we felt like we needed to memorialize it and memorialize God's goodness. And so the front of the rock says, Elisha, Three Fires Camp. And the back of the rock says, the God who hears my prayers for my son. And so I had an opportunity a couple weeks ago to tell Elisha, pardon me, about this rock, because he didn't know that his mom and dad were praying for him. And the awe in his eyes that came melted me. And it reminded him that God is in his story, that God is caring for his heart. And so as we think about memorial, these are ways in which we remember God's faithfulness. And as my son continues to grow older, no matter what happens to him, I always have this rock to remind me that there's a God who hears my prayers for my son. And so with that in mind, we want to transition and invite you to a practice that we have been living into for the last year. In this glass house, there are other stories of what God has done that our children are aware of. And so at your table, there are rocks. And if you're at a table that doesn't have rocks, we'd love to invite you to go to a table that has rocks and as we transition into this portion.
So the goal of this activity is really to awaken the power of remembrance in your heart, and to begin to think through, reflect, and mark and pass on stories of God's presence in your life. And so this is a very practical way of doing it. And we want to start with a kind of a individual reflection. So this would be a quiet activity. And actually what I'll probably do is some of you have 4 people, so I may even come collect some of the extra rocks and try to disperse them for people who may not have some, and we may not have rocks for everybody. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Anyway, but I want you to do some guided questions for, these are the guided questions for individual reflection. So spend a few quiet moments thinking about a time when you clearly experienced God's presence, God's provision, God's rescue, even God's rebuke. Use these prompts to help you remember what was happening in your life at that time. What did you deeply need from God? How did God meet you in that moment? Who else was affected by what God did? What did this experience teach you about who God is? And part of the question I want you to ask yourself as you're reflecting is, what story do I want to pass down to future generations about how God met me? And I don't want you to think it has to be something really extreme, or it doesn't have to be something like a big, God meets us in mundane moments.
Right.
And so don't think it has to look a certain way or be a certain way. It just has to be a moment where you know without a shadow of a doubt, God has encountered you. And so as you're reflecting, we have index cards on your table. If you want to use that to kind of jot down notes, feel free to do that. But we're going to give you about 7 to 10 minutes to kind of think and reflect individually.
Yep, and so we'd love to transition to this time with a word of prayer as you reflect on where God has met you in your own story. Would you join me in prayer? Father, you are faithful throughout generations, and your name is great. I pray as we would reflect this morning on where we have met you in our story, that you would come and you would bring to remembrance, God, the moments where we have experienced and tasted your goodness, God. We commit this time to you in Christ's name. Amen. Let me offer one more just word of instruction we forgot about. What we'd like to invite you to do during this time of reflection at the conclusion is write on your rock. You'll see at your table as well permanent markers. If you don't have one, please raise your hand. But we'd like for you to write what God has done on the front of the rock. And on the back of the rock, write what you learned about God, what God revealed to you about his nature. It might be that God hears my prayers. It might be like mine, God hears my prayers for my son. But on the front of the rock, an invitation to write what actually happened, and on the back of the rock to write what you learned about God from this experience. Thank you.
I want you to remember that these stones aren't just souvenirs, but they really are signposts for where God has shown up and where God can continue to show up, in God's faithfulness for generations to come. And we just showed you one method. There are many other methods that you could practice the spiritual discipline of remembrance. And so we do want you to think at some point when you leave here, what other practices could you do that's organic to your life and to what makes sense for you. I do have, if you're interested, kind of instruction cards. If you want to practice this again, I'll stand back there and give instruction cards. But just as a closing charge, I guess, want you to think about how might your faith or the faith of your children be different if you faithfully practiced keeping record of God's faithfulness. And so I just want you to continue to reflect on that.
Yeah.
And just in conclusion, kind of the things that we talked about and covered is that memorials help recall God's faithfulness and power in the past, reinforce and fuel our faith in God's nature, remember and root our identity as a people of God in God's story, and that's both communal but also individually, and then point others to the greatness of God, that these stories are missional, and these memorials are missional.